Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I wouldn't go and hide behind this lectern if I had a little microphone I could walk about with, but here we are. So my name is Gert Nonnemann. In case you hadn't come across me before, I'm the Dean of this wonderful institution, School of Foreign Service in Qatar, SFSQ, or indeed GUQ, as you know it from the media, Georgetown in Qatar. And tonight we're doing one of these events that we like to think we're good at, and I think tonight will prove it. That is bringing particularly eminent speakers from around the world to share with us and with you their expertise, their experience, their insights into particular aspects of global politics. And tonight we've got a particularly eminent example of what we try to do. Dr. Bunag from Thailand, for a long time the senior diplomat of the country, and of course also a former foreign minister. But I'm not going to introduce him any further, because those of you who are familiar with these sorts of events know that we have a very peculiar tradition here at Georgetown, and that is that if we get someone who's particularly worth introducing, then we get one of our best students to do that, because we want to showcase our students, and it's partly showing that this is all about a community of scholarship, from freshmen or freshwomen, if that term can be coined, to seniors and faculty members and staff and members of the wider community, because the whole point about a Georgetown education is it integrates what is learned within the classroom with what exists outside. Indeed, it integrates teaching and scholarship and learning with engaging with the community, whether that community is Qatar, the Gulf, or the world. So I think it's particularly suitable, particularly fitting for us to have His Excellency Dr. Bunag introduced by our first and currently only Thai student, freshman in the Bachelor in Foreign Service program. And I'm going to again have to defer to, in terms of pronunciation. Say again. Mandrawi, that's right. I'm sure I still got it wrong. And I have no excuse, because my wife is Thai. But somehow, as my son keeps telling me, my Thai pronunciation is awful.
Sawadika and good evening. Your Excellency Dr. Det Bunag, Dean Nonnemann, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Georgetown University in Qatar. It is of great pleasure to introduce His Excellency Dr. Det Bunag, who was speaking tonight on Thai Foreign Service from a long-term perspective, and he will focus on regional and global context. His Excellency is a prominent Thai scholar and diplomat. He obtained his Master of Arts from Cambridge University, his Doctorate of Philosophy from Oxford University. He also has been awarded honorary doctorate degree from Huaqiao University in People's Republic of China. His consistent and inspiring devotion to the Thai Foreign Service led to notable appointments and posting around the globe. Dr. Bunag worked as ASEAN Secretariat and was appointed as the Thai ambassador to China, to the United States of America, and France. He served as a permanent representative of Thailand at the United Nations and UNESCO. He also was an advisor in the Office of His Majesty Principal Private Secretary until 2008, at which point he was appointed as the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Today, His Excellency is an Assistant Secretary General for Administration at the Thai Red Cross Society and an advisor for various educational organizations. Learning about Dr. Bunag's outstanding achievement made me reflect on possible meanings of being in public service. I have often wondered what motivates great visionaries such as Dr. Bunag to lead his life full of devotions and dedication to others. As a public servant, how could one remain diligent in delivering his best to advance the interests and to serve the needs of his greater community. Dr. Bunak's work provide me ample of answers. It is now clear to me that the most crucial thing about having privileges, be it educational or professional, it is the ability to transform such a great opportunities into contributions that can create positive impact in the lives that we touch. And on that note, please join me in extending warm welcome to His Excellency Dr. Thet Bunak.
Dean Noneman, Venerable Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your kind words and your kind words of introduction. Like your freshman, I was once upon a time, 50 years ago, also a Thai government scholar. So I'm very proud that she is the first Thai government scholar to be at your school here this year. I should also say that when I was ambassador in Washington, D.C., I also gave a talk exactly like this to the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service at about exactly the same time in 2001. So about 14 years later, I'm very grateful, Dean Noneman, for your invitation for me to talk to this group today at this campus of Georgetown University in Doha, Qatar. The subject that was given to me, it wasn't my original title. It was expanded to Thai foreign policy in long-term perspective, navigating the regional and the global. With such a long title, I was given only half an hour, and normally with such a long title, it would probably need a whole semester for me to talk about Thai foreign policy in the long-term perspective. Nevertheless, I will try to say something about Thai foreign policy in the long-term perspective within about 30 minutes or 40 minutes, and then I will be open to any questions that you would care to address to me, and I'll try my best to answer them. When we talk about the long-term perspective, how long should that perspective be? In modern Thai history, we usually start with the year 1855. The reason why we start in the year 1855 was that in that year we signed a treaty with the British called the Bowring Treaty, after the name of the British envoy, who was Governor General of the British colony of Hong Kong, and who was sent to the court of King Rama IV in that year to negotiate opening diplomatic relations and opening of Siam, as it was then known, to what the British were fond of calling free trade. By free trade, it meant that they fixed the tax and duty that we were able to levy on British goods at 3%. It was fixed at 3%, and that they also, British citizens trading with Siam or trading with Siam were also granted extraterritorial rights. What extraterritorial rights meant was that they did not have to go to Thai courts, and they went to the British consular court, which was chaired by the British consul himself. In other words, from 1855 onwards, Thailand, or Siam as it was then, lost its fiscal independence as well as lost its judicial independence. Now, the question asked is then, why did Siam agree to the Bowring Treaty in 1855, which became the model for all our other treaties with Western countries, including the USA and Japan later on? It is to preserve our independence at a time of Western imperialism and colonialism in Asia, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. And that is the theme of my talk, Thai foreign policy in the long-term perspective. What was it? Throughout, from the year 1855 until today, I think the theme is always how to, as you said, how to navigate the regional and the global, how to survive and succeed in a dangerous world, how to survive as an independent country, and to continue to conduct a foreign policy that is as free and as constructive and as positive and as practical as possible for one's own country. So we started off by being very, very practical and compromise with the British in that we agreed to limit our financial and fiscal independence. We agreed to limit our judicial independence so that the British and later the French would not colonize our country. Now, there are many, from 1855 onwards, there are many stories to tell, many challenges, and we even had one war with France in 1893, at the end of which we lost territory, we lost even more of our independence, but we survived. The core of the country remained legally, by international law, independent. By being adaptable and by compromising with the major European powers, and also by reforming our own administration, which was the subject of my PhD thesis, how we reformed our provincial administration to centralize the provincial administration, so that the British and the French would have no excuse in interfering in the internal affairs of the Kingdom of Siam. So from 1855 until 1914, the outbreak of the First World War, it was a very precarious time, but we managed to survive. And during that time, along with the reforms in the provincial administration and the reform in the government in general, we also participate in international organizations, so that the organization that I'm working with today, the Thai Red Cross Society, was founded in 1893, the second oldest in Asia after that of Japan. We were one of the co-founders of the Universal Postal Union. So, in other words, Siam also became a member of international society. And all these things stood us in good stead. For those of you who are historians, they may even teach it here. Siam also participated in those very, very early international meetings for world peace, known as the Hague Conference. There were 2 or 3 meetings of the Hague Conference on world peace, and Siam participated in them. And a major breaking point was in 1917, Siam decided to join the Allies in the First World War, and so we participated in the First World War at the very end of it, at the very end of the First World War, which enabled Siam to participate in the Congress of Versailles, which led to the founding of the League of Nations. So from 1855 to 1917, we just managed by the skin of our teeth to survive European Western colonialism, and emerged at the end of the First World War as a co-founder of the League of Nations. So in other words, we survived the period of Western imperialism as an independent country. That would be the first phase of the long-term perspective of Thai foreign policy. The second phase would be the period from the founding of the League of Nations until roughly the Second World War. And it is during this period when Siam was a member of the League of Nations that she negotiated with the French and the British and other countries to regain her fiscal and judicial independence, which was fully achieved by about 1933. So by 1933, when the British Empire and the French Empire were still going strong, we had fully achieved our independence from extraterritoriality and from our fiscal lack of full independence. So after surviving imperialism, I think the next period is a combination which ended, I think, only quite recently in 1991, and that is from 1917 onwards, how we also survived communism, fascism, and communism and fascism, and the way we survived this was through our membership of the League of Nations, a very active one. The only international meeting held outside Geneva during the time of the League of Nations was actually held in Bangkok. And it also gave birth to the first international agreement with the word Bangkok in it. And this came during the period of the interwar period between the First and the Second World War. In 1932, we had a coup d'etat, the first of many, and some would prefer to call it a revolution, but it was really a coup d'etat, which ended the absolute monarchy. And the people who led the coup d'etat in 1932 were the core leadership were mostly had mostly been educated had mostly been educated abroad, especially in France, at the French military school, at the French grand schools, and half of them, half the core leaders were military, and the other half were civilians. But on both sides were initially united in 1932, but they largely split between a kind of left-wing socialist group and a right-wing sort of fascist nationalist group. With this kind of division from 1932 until the beginning of the Second World War in 1939, it meant that the Thai government had to adjust its policy to be both liberal and nationalistic. And so when it came to vote to condemn Japan, when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1933, Siam was the only country at the League of Nations which abstained. And for this, she was very much condemned, especially by the Western powers. But from my own personal reading of it, I think that the Siamese abstention from condemning Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1933 was a game-changing moment, and it signified, as it were, a maturity in Siam's foreign policy, in that it was going to be independent of the Western powers, and that it would not condemn a fellow Asian country. This took place in 1933, and then from when the Second World War started in 1939, Siam, as did Siam at the beginning of the First World War, declared its neutrality. But of course, it was very difficult because the Japanese invaded Siam at the end of 1941, just at about the same time of Pearl Harbor. So when the Siamese government was supposed to have declared war on the Allies, and especially the United States of America, but our ambassador in Washington, D.C. at the time refused to deliver the declaration of war. By international law, it didn't matter, because you don't have to deliver the declaration of war once you have declared war on one side or the other. The declaration is already made. But the Siamese government, the government of Siam, maintained that it never delivered the declaration of war, so it was never at war with the United States of America. And at the end of the war, and during the war, there was also the Thai resistance under a movement called the Free Thai. So they maintain that the ambassador of Siam in Washington, D.C. was actually the representative of the Siamese government, and therefore Siam was an ally of the UN powers from the very beginning, and therefore it was not to be declared an enemy nation. This point of view was not very well taken by the British and the Americans and the other allies, as you can imagine, and it took a lot of diplomatic legworks for the government of Siam to get out of that situation after the end of the Second World War, and after having to pay reparation to both the British and the French by rice. For this period of 1917 or 1919 until 1946, again, it's a question of how to survive, how to survive the end of imperialism, and how to maintain one's independence. And throughout this period, an expression became sort of well known about Siam and the Siamese, and you may have heard of it. It's called Siamese talk. The British and the French were fond of saying that you can't rely on the Siamese or Siam. Another expression is that Siam was always bending with the wind, like the bamboo. And some of our neighbors later even added that Siam didn't just bend with the wind, but Siam bended even before the wind came. And some of my elders and betters always get very upset about this. I wasn't at all upset. I thought it was a very good description of Siam's foreign policy, and that is, you just don't bend with the wind, but one should know where the wind is coming from, and bend before it hits you. So I was quite proud of it. From the end of the Second World War, and we managed to join the United Nations in 1946. In the third phase, in consideration of Thai foreign policy in the long perspective, I would say, how from 1917, and especially from 1946 or 1949, how did we survive communism? Why I mentioned 1949 was that the Russian Revolution in 1917 was a little bit far from Siam, but the revolution, the change of government, the revolution in China in 1949 was very near. And as you know, we have a substantial overseas Chinese population in Siam, Thailand. When the Chinese had their first great revolution, great Republican revolution in 1911, the overseas Chinese in Siam were very keen on republicanism and wanted to persuade their Thai hosts to be Republicans as well. The Communist Party of Thailand was founded in 1933 interestingly, not by overseas Chinese, but there's a fact that has just been recently discovered. The Communist Party of Thailand was founded actually by Ho Chi Minh. It's just been discovered only over the past few years. Ho Chi Minh at the time was the representative of the Comintern for Southeast Asia, and he came to Siam and founded the Communist Party of Thailand. But then they lost out. There was a power struggle within the Communist Party of Thailand, and they lost out to the overseas Chinese elements within that party. So people always think of the Communist Party of Thailand as being a branch of the Communist Party of China. But in fact, at the beginning, it was directly under the Comintern and under Ho Chi Minh. So from let's say 1949 until the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, how did Thai foreign policy enable Thai to enable the country to survive that period? I should go back just a little bit to say why I say Siam and Thailand and Thai. The word Siam, in one form or another, has always been what foreigners have called the country, starting with the Chinese. But the people, the majority of the people who live in the country had always called themselves Thai. And the word Thai, just like the word franc or France, or for the French, it just means free people. It just means a free people. And then the name of Siam was changed to Thailand during our nationalist phase, when they thought that the name of the country should be called the Land of the Thais. I'm not particularly fond of this word Thailand, with one part of it being Thai and then the other part being land in English, because it is not in the Thai language, and the traditional name has always been Siam. And if they were to use the word Thai, it should be another word instead of land, such as Pratet, like Bangladesh, because Pradesh means nation in Sanskrit. But from the Second World War from the end of the Second World War till the present day, the country has always been named Thailand in English, and its population Thai nationals. So how did we survive this period from, in European terms, starting with the Russian Revolution in 1917, Chinese Revolution in 1949, and then till the end of the Soviet Union in 1991? I think, again, Thai foreign policy is always very consistent in its inconsistency. So Take, for instance, the year up to the mid-1950s. We were friendly with those countries which founded the non-aligned movement. So that in 1955, when there was a meeting which led to the founding of the non-aligned movement, the rapporteur was actually a Thai foreign minister, Prince Wan Waitiakon, who was that year also the president of the United Nations General Assembly. But at the same time, in 1954, Prince Wan had also signed the so-called Manila Treaty. The Manila Treaty founded the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which was going to be the Southeast Asian end of NATO. You had NATO for the North Atlantic, you have CENTO for this part of the world, and then SEATO for Southeast Asia. So in 1954, he had signed the Manila Treaty, but at the same time, in 1955, he was rapporteur for the Bandung meeting, which led to the founding of the non-aligned movement. So my point is that Thai foreign policy has always moved in such a way as not to have all your eggs in one basket, and that there should always be a way out of the situation. We didn't join the non-aligned movement officially until it had lost all raison d'être. And then we stayed with the Manila Treaty, and the organization of SEATO was based in Bangkok until the very end. And the Manila Treaty has never been revoked. So the Manila Treaty for the joint defense of Southeast Asia still stands. And when the Manila Treaty was signed, of course, I was only 10 years old, so I had nothing to do with it. But when SEATO ended, but the Manila Treaty was maintained, I traveled with my foreign minister to Australia, New Zealand, Washington D.C., and to maintain that the Manila Treaty still stands, and it still stands today. By the 1950s, it would seem that we were fully in the camp of the Western powers, with headquarters of SEATO being actually in Bangkok. 10 years later, the Vietnam War broke out, and as you know, Thailand was named as the biggest American aircraft carrier in the world, because there were 6 huge US bases in Thailand by the late 1960s. But at the same time, our great foreign minister, Thanath Korman, already had a reinsurance policy, in that in 1967, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, was founded in Bangkok. And I think that was a very clever move of his, that apart from having SEATO and the Manila Treaty, he also had the Bangkok Declaration and the ASEAN in case anything went wrong with SEATO and the Manila Treaty, as it soon did. When I first joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1969, at the beginning of February 1969, the writing was already on the wall about the Vietnam War. And you will recall that in the middle of that year, President Nixon visited Southeast Asia, South Vietnam, and Bangkok. But before he came to Southeast Asia, he stopped in the US territory of Guam and announced the so-called Guam Doctrine, which was later called the Vietnamization Doctrine. For anybody with any intelligence, one would know that that was really the beginning of the end of the Vietnam War. And how can you Vietnamize the Vietnam War? And it was just a way of saying that the US was going to leave. And although it took several more years, in fact, 10 more full years not quite, 6 more years from 1969 to 1975 that the US left South Vietnam for good. But the writing was on the wall, and that the end of the war was coming to an end. And so what was Siam to do? And what was Thailand going to do? And what we did was immediately after the Guam Doctrine was announced, was to begin the normalization of relations with the People's Republic of China. And for that, I'm very proud that at my level of Chief of Division, I was responsible for the negotiations, and Thai People's Republic of China's relations were normalized in 1975, just in time for the end of the Vietnam War. So this is another trait of Thai foreign policy, apart from bending with the wind or bending before the wind, but just in time. We did it just in time. And so it's very interesting that the first ASEAN summit was called by President Suharto at the beginning of 1976, about 6, 7, or 8 months after the end of the Vietnam War. And the end of the Vietnam War really stimulated the integration of ASEAN. And so by the end of this year, on the 4th of January next year, ASEAN will become a community. A community, not a European community, but an ASEAN community. So that would be the sort of another phase of Thai foreign policy, how we survived the communist era, which more or less ended with the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. Of course, there are many stories to tell, but they are details. in the last part of my presentation is how to link Thai foreign policy and Southeast Asia to this part of the world. For after all, I'm standing here at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service in Doha. When I became permanent secretary for Foreign Affairs in 2001, so 14 years ago, Thailand undertook another initiative in foreign policy, which I thought was very important. I was very skeptical about it at the beginning, as a civil servant, as a career diplomat. My political masters at the time had dreamt up something called the ACD. It was called the Asian Cooperation Dialogue. And we had a lot of discussion about this at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Said, what is this ACD about? Because we already have the ASEAN, so in our foreign policy. So where does ACD fit in? And now we had some very, very good discussions, and which came out with some real visionary ideas. And the idea was that we have ASEAN of 10 countries in Southeast Asia. We already had at that time the Asia-Europe meeting called the ASEM, which was an initiative of Singapore. But the first summit, the first ASEM summit, was actually held in Bangkok. So what we needed was some kind of overarching cooperation between this part of the world and East Asia. And this idea was first presented at a meeting of democratic parties in Manila. And it was not so, it was received with skepticism, but the people who proposed it followed through and implemented it, so that we would have a cooperation between the Gulf states and then in the Far East, China and Japan. And it, for the past 15 years, it's been very difficult, but nevertheless, it's still going. We still have we still have meetings, we have projects, and we know each other much better than if we did not have it. Because otherwise, we would not have a forum where Southeast Asian countries would meet with countries from the Gulf region. So that's a new overarching initiative. At the same time, while I was Permanent Secretary for Foreign Affairs, the thought was that ASEAN, even ASEAN with 10 countries, was too big, too large, and that we should cooperate more closely with our mainland neighbors, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. So was initiated another regional organization called ACMEX, or Ayeyarwady Chao Phraya Mae Khong Economic Cooperation System. So that is to make sort of the Southeast Asian mainland countries cooperate more closely together within the ASEAN context. And then we have this overarching ACD. And that is where Thailand is today, with new challenges within ASEAN itself, that by the 4th of January next year, there will be an ASEAN community. But we are also moving into a sort of a new game, a new era of risks and challenges and dangers, especially for Southeast Asia, with the problem in the South China Sea, with claimants being China and Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and so on. So these are real challenges that that Thailand, which is not involved in in these particular disputes in the South China Sea, could play an important role in being the middleman between China and the other countries, China and Japan, China and Indonesia, and so on. So there is never an end to history. It's always in the making, and that is the whole fun of international relations and foreign policy and foreign service. So I think I'd like to end right on time here, so that you can ask me any questions that you like. Thank you very much.